You know El Chapo. Everyone knows El Chapo. Joaquin Guzman Lora, the most famous drug lord on the planet. Arrested 3 times. Escaped from maximum security prison twice, once through a tunnel dug directly beneath his shower. Recaptured. Extradited to the United States. Put on trial in New York. Convicted on all counts. Now sitting in ADX Florence, the Supermax prison in Colorado where the worst of the worst spend the rest of their lives in a concrete box. El Chapo is done. His story is over. You know the Sinaloa Cartel, the most powerful drug trafficking organization in the world, responsible for moving the majority of illegal drugs into the United States of America. Fentanyl, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, all of it flowing through their pipelines, worth an estimated $30 to $50 billion a year. Still operating, still killing, still untouchable in many ways despite decades of effort from law enforcement on both sides of the border. You know the Mexican drug war. You've seen the images. Bodies hanging from bridges on the US-Mexico border. Mass graves discovered in fields and mountains, some containing hundreds of victims. Entire towns abandoned because cartels moved in and everyone else moved out. Police chiefs assassinated. Journalists murdered for reporting the truth. Mayors fleeing their own cities. Villages where cartel members outnumber government soldiers. A war that has claimed over 400,000 lives. 400,000 human beings. Fathers, mothers, children, police officers, soldiers, farmers, students. 400,000 people dead since 2006 alone. And the killing continues today as you watch this video. You've watched Narcos Mexico on Netflix. Diego Luna as Felix Gallardo, the sophisticated, calculating, brilliantly strategic kingpin who built an empire from nothing. Michael Pena as Kiki Camarena, the DA agent who got too close to the truth and paid for it with his life. 3 seasons, 72 episodes. One of the most watched shows on Netflix. Millions of people around the world sat down and watched that story unfold. But here's the thing. Here's what nobody told you. Here's the mystery hiding in plain sight. El Chapo? He was an employee, a worker, a driver at the beginning, a manager later, but always working for someone else's system, someone else's structure, someone else's organization. The Sinaloa Cartel? It didn't just appear out of thin air. It was created, deliberately, by design, carved out of a larger organization and handed to specific people like a gift or a curse, depending on how you look at it. The Mexican drug war? It didn't start because of random chaos. It started because of one decision. One single decision made by one man sitting in a prison cell in 1989. A man who, at that moment, thought he was being reasonable. Thought he was doing the right thing. Thought he was organizing a peaceful transition that would prevent exactly the kind of violence that then exploded and has never stopped. That man's name is Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. Born 1946, Sinaloa, Mexico. Started as a police officer, literally sworn to uphold the law. Ended up controlling 90% of all cocaine entering the United States of America. Not through bombs, not through terrorism, not through the savage, apocalyptic violence that Pablo Escobar unleashed on Colombia. Through something far more sophisticated and far more dangerous. Through business, through negotiation, through intelligence, through an almost supernatural ability to make powerful people trust him and work with him. He created something called the Federation, a concept so elegant and so effective that it transformed Mexican drug trafficking from a chaotic, violent mess of competing small operations into a single unified machine, disciplined, coordinated, and incredibly profitable. Under the Federation, Mexican drug traffickers stopped fighting each other. They shared routes, they shared profits, they cooperated, and together they became the most powerful drug trafficking network in human history. By 1987, Felix Gallardo was moving more cocaine than anyone in the world outside of the Colombians who produced it. Pablo Escobar grew cocaine in Colombia. Felix Gallardo moved it into America. Together, they controlled the entire pipeline from Jungle Laboratory to American City Street. And they made billions. Actual billions. The kind of money that lets you bribe entire governments. And that's exactly what Felix did. He didn't just bribe individual police officers. He didn't just pay off a few judges. He corrupted entire institutions. Police commanders, military generals, governors, federal politicians, border agents on both sides. He didn't rule through fear. He ruled through money. He made himself indispensable to the very people who were supposed to stop him. He was genuinely untouchable. For years and years, he was completely untouchable. Then came Kiki Camarena, and everything changed. February 1985. A DEA agent named Enrique Camarena, everyone called him Kiki, had been in Guadalajara for years, quietly and brilliantly investigating the Federation, getting closer and closer to Felix, building a case that threatened to unravel everything. And then Kiki did something that cost the Federation $8 billion. He found a plantation, the biggest marijuana plantation ever discovered in the history of drug enforcement. 2,500 acres of marijuana growing in the Mexican desert. $8 billion worth of product. Destroyed. Burned. Gone. The Federation was furious, and they did something catastrophically stupid. They kidnapped Kiki Camarena, tortured him for 30 hours, then murdered him. And in doing so, they triggered the most aggressive and sustained law enforcement response in DEA history. The United States of America did not forgive the murder of its agents. April 8, 1989. After 4 years of relentless pressure, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo was arrested. He was 43 years old. He has not been a free man since that day. In prison in 1989, Felix made one final decision. He knew he wasn't getting out. He knew the Federation needed new leadership. So he called a meeting with all his major lieutenants. They came to the prison because he still had enough power to make that happen, and he divided Mexico into territories, like slicing a pizza. Tijuana went to the Arellano Felix brothers. Juárez went to Amado Carrillo Fuentes. Sinaloa went to a young lieutenant named Joaquin Guzman, El Chapo, and his partner Ismael Zambada. The Gulf went to Juan Garcia Abrego. Felix thought this was a peaceful solution. An organized transition. Each leader gets their piece. Everyone stays in their lane. Business continues. What actually happened is that those organizations immediately began competing with each other, fighting over routes, over territory, over power. The careful peace that Felix had maintained through intelligence and diplomacy shattered the moment he went to prison. And the violence that replaced it has never truly stopped. Since 1989, more than 400,000 people have been killed in Mexico's drug war. Many of them directly because of the competition between the very cartels that Felix Gallardo created on that day in prison. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo is 80 years old. He is blind. He is sick. He has been in prison for 37 years. And the violence that his decisions, including his attempt at a peaceful transition, unleashed on Mexico continues every single day. This is the complete, true story of the man who created modern Mexican cartels. Not the Netflix version. Not the Diego Luna version. The real man. The real story. Every fact sourced from DEA files, Mexican government records, and the definitive investigative books written by people who spent decades uncovering the truth. You've seen El Chapo. You've seen Escobar. Now meet the man who made both of them possible. The godfather of Mexican cartels. Before we travel back to Sinaloa, Mexico, in 1946, drop a comment right now telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I want to see how far this story reaches. Because the effects of what Felix Gallardo built reach into every country, every city, every neighborhood where drugs are sold. His creation is global. Hit subscribe right now because this is part of my Narcos series. I covered Pablo Escobar, the Colombian who produced the cocaine. Now I'm covering Felix Gallardo, the Mexican who moved it into America. Together, these two stories give you the complete picture of how the cocaine pipeline was built, how it grew, and why it still exists today. After this video, you will understand the modern cartel world in a way that most people, including most journalists, never fully explain. Like this video right now. One thumbs up takes you 1 second. That thumbs up tells the algorithm this story matters. Here is exactly what you are about to watch. The complete story of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. Born in poverty, became a police officer, became a trafficker, became the most powerful drug lord in Mexican history, without ever being as famous as the people who worked under him. The Kiki Camarena murder that brought him down. His arrest. The prison meeting that created every major Mexican cartel that exists today. And why 400,000 people have died because of his decisions. This is not a story about simple evil. This is not Pablo Escobar, bombs and assassinations and terrorism. This is something more complex, more interesting, more disturbing. This is a story about a man who genuinely believed he was creating order, who genuinely believed he was preventing violence, who in trying to organize crime made it permanent, scalable, and catastrophically violent after his departure. Let's begin. Sinaloa, Mexico, 1946, the birthplace of everything that followed. To understand Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, you first need to understand where he came from. Because where you come from shapes everything. And the place Felix came from, the state of Sinaloa on Mexico's Pacific coast, wasn't just an accident of birth. It was, in many ways, destiny. If you wanted to grow up to become the most powerful drug trafficker in the world, there was no better place on earth to be born in 1946 than Sinaloa, Mexico. Let me explain this place to you simply, because most people outside Mexico have only the vaguest idea of what Sinaloa actually is. Sinaloa is a state like a state in the United States, a region within a larger country. It sits on the western coast of Mexico, facing the Pacific Ocean. Its capital city is Culiacán, which is where Felix Gallardo was born. The state has about 3 million people today, and in 1946, when Felix was born, it was significantly smaller, poorer, and more isolated. The geography of Sinaloa is critical to understanding everything that followed, because Sinaloa has a very specific combination of physical features that made it, essentially, the perfect location for drug production and trafficking. On one side, you have the coast, beaches, coves, ports, which means ocean access for boats carrying contraband. On the other side, just inland, you have the Sierra Madre Occidental mountain range. These are serious mountains. Remote, rugged, cut off from easy access. The kind of terrain where you can grow things and move things without anyone easily finding you. And between the coast and the mountains, you have valleys, fertile valleys with good soil and warm weather. Perfect agricultural land. The people living in those mountain valleys in the 1940s were poor. Genuinely, deeply poor. Mexican farmers in Sinaloa in that era were growing corn and beans and barely surviving. The land could sustain subsistence farming, but not much more. There was no industry. There were no good jobs. Poverty wasn't a crisis. It was simply the permanent condition of life. You were born poor. You lived poor. You died poor. And your children did the same. Now here is where history takes an interesting and dark turn. In the 1940s, right around when Felix Gallardo was being born, something changed in those Sinaloan mountains. And the change came from two separate directions at once, which combined into something powerful. The first direction was immigration. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, significant numbers of Chinese immigrants had come to Sinaloa and the neighboring state of Sonora. They came to work on railroads and in mines. They brought with them cultural knowledge from Southeast Asia, including knowledge of the opium poppy, how to grow it, how to process it, how to produce opium. That knowledge embedded itself in the region. The second direction was war. World War II. When America entered the war in 1941, the U.S. military had an immediate problem. It needed enormous quantities of morphine for wounded soldiers. Morphine comes from opium. Opium comes from poppies. And the United States, through channels that weren't exactly official but weren't exactly secret either, effectively encouraged Mexican farmers in Sinaloa and neighboring regions to grow opium poppies. The U.S. needed the product. The Sinaloan farmers needed income. A deal was struck. Poppies were grown. Opium was produced. When the war ended in 1945, the poppy farms didn't disappear. Why would they? For the first time in generations, these farmers had found a crop that paid significantly better than corn and beans. And by then, there were buyers. Not American military buyers anymore, civilian buyers. People in American cities who had developed opium and heroin habits during and after the war. The market existed. The supply existed. The connection between them was just a matter of logistics. Then came the 1960s, and with the 1960s came marijuana, the hippie movement, the counterculture, the explosion of recreational drug use across American college campuses and cities. The demand for marijuana in the United States grew at an extraordinary rate throughout the 1960s. And Sinaloa, with its perfect agricultural valleys, its remote mountains, and its established culture of growing illegal crops, was ideally positioned to meet that demand. By the time Felix Gallardo was a teenager in the early 1960s, Sinaloa had an established, if relatively small, drug economy. Farmers grew marijuana and poppies in the mountains. Small traffickers collected the product and moved it north toward the U.S. border. Money flowed back south. It wasn't organized. It wasn't particularly violent because the scale was still small and everyone more or less knew each other. But it was real and it was growing, and it touched virtually every family in the state either directly or indirectly. Growing up in Culiacan in the 1950s and early 1960s, Felix Gallardo would have been aware of all of this. He would have seen traffickers in the community, men who dressed better, drove better vehicles, had money in a place where money was scarce. He would have understood, the way children always understand these things without being explicitly taught, that there was a shadow economy operating alongside the legitimate one. That there was a way to escape poverty that didn't involve decades of backbreaking agricultural labor. But Felix didn't jump straight into trafficking. He was smarter than that. He took a route that would give him something far more valuable than early money. He took a route that would give him knowledge, connections, and power. He became a police officer. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo was born on January 8, 1946, in Culiacan, the capital city of Sinaloa. His family was poor, his father worked as a farmer, and there was nothing particularly special about his circumstances that would have predicted what he would become. He was not born into the narco world. He was not the son of traffickers. He was just a boy from a poor family in a poor state, trying to figure out how to build a life. What separated Felix from the beginning was not his background. It was his mind. By every account from people who knew him, DA agents who investigated him, journalists who interviewed him, associates who worked with him, Felix Gallardo was exceptionally intelligent. Not in the academic sense, though he was educated enough. In the practical sense, the strategic sense, he understood systems. He understood people. He understood how power worked and how to accumulate it without making enemies. He was the kind of person who walked into a room and within 5 minutes had a sense of who mattered, what they wanted, and how to give it to them. He was also, by all accounts, charismatic. Not in the loud, theatrical way of some powerful people. In a quieter, more effective way. He made people feel seen. He made people feel that he respected them. He was the kind of man that other men trusted almost instinctively, because he never seemed to be trying to take advantage of anyone, even when, of course, he always was. And he was disciplined about his image. Throughout his career as a trafficker, Felix Gallardo dressed like a businessman. Expensive suits, well-groomed, professional. He didn't swagger around with gold chains and bodyguards making a show of his power. He could walk through a hotel lobby or attend a business dinner and look like exactly what he wanted to look like. A successful, legitimate Mexican businessman. This was deliberate. This was strategy. In the late 1960s, Felix Gallardo joined the Federal Judicial Police. This is an important point. He didn't join a small local police department. He joined the federal police, roughly analogous to the FBI in the United States. This gave him access to federal intelligence, federal contacts, and a federal network of colleagues and superiors that extended across the entire country. His assignment was Sinaloa, his home state, which meant that as a federal police officer, he was assigned to investigate precisely the criminal networks that he had grown up around and that he would eventually join. The irony is almost too perfect. The man who would become the godfather of Mexican cartels spent his early career learning everything about drug trafficking from the inside of the institution designed to stop it. Now, you need to understand something crucial about Mexican police in this era, because without understanding it, nothing that follows makes sense. Mexican federal police officers in the late 1960s and early 1970s earned very low salaries. Genuinely low. We're talking about a monthly income that in today's terms would be almost laughably insufficient for survival in a major city. The official salary was so low that it was almost a joke. Meanwhile, drug traffickers were making enormous amounts of money even then, before the cocaine boom, just on marijuana and heroin. And those traffickers needed protection. They needed people inside law enforcement who would warn them about raids, lose paperwork, look the other way. The bribes were extraordinary relative to the official salary. A drug trafficker might offer a police commander 10 times his monthly salary just to ignore a single operation. 20 times, 50 times. And this wasn't an exceptional situation, it was the norm. Corruption wasn't a deviation from the system. It was baked into the system. Everyone understood that police officers supplemented their official income with unofficial payments. The government essentially built the corruption into the salary structure by paying so little that no one could survive without it. So Felix Gallardo, joining the federal police in the late 1960s, found himself in an institution where corruption was the default setting. Where the question wasn't, should I take bribes? But rather, which traffickers should I take them from? Where the institutional culture normalized the very behavior that made trafficking possible. This was his education. For several years, Felix Gallardo sat at the center of the spider web, not as a trafficker but as the officer responsible for investigating traffickers. He saw how the networks operated. He saw which routes were used. He understood which officials were on which payrolls. He built relationships on both sides of the law simultaneously. And he was paying very close attention to everything. The most important relationship he formed during this period was with a man named Pedro Aviles Perez. And understanding Pedro Aviles is essential to understanding everything that Felix became. Pedro Aviles Perez was, in the history of Mexican drug trafficking, one of the founding fathers. He was born in the 1930s or 1940s. The exact date is uncertain, in Sinaloa, and by the 1970s he had built himself into the most significant drug trafficker operating out of northwest Mexico. His nickname was El León de la Sierra, the Lion of the Mountains. Fit him. He operated out of the Sinaloan mountains, growing and trafficking marijuana, and he had an innovation that made him significantly ahead of his time. He used airplanes. While other traffickers were loading marijuana onto trucks and driving it painfully slowly toward the U.S. border, exposed to checkpoints, exposed to police, exposed to rivals, Pedro Aviles was loading it onto small aircraft and flying it directly. Over the mountains, over the border, into American airfields where buyers were waiting. Faster, harder to detect, much more efficient. This sounds obvious now, but in the early 1970s it was revolutionary. And it made Pedro Aviles significantly richer and more powerful than his competitors. When Felix Gallardo met Pedro Aviles during his time as a federal police officer, what happened was not an arrest. What happened was a conversation. A conversation about how the world actually worked versus how it was supposed to work. Felix was intelligent enough to see immediately that Pedro Aviles represented something, a model, an example of what was possible in Sinaloa if you were smart enough and organized enough to pursue it. And Pedro Aviles was intelligent enough to see in the young federal police officer a resource, someone inside the institution who could provide protection and intelligence. They made an arrangement. Pedro paid Felix. Felix protected Pedro. Simple, clean, profitable for both. And in the process, Felix received something even more valuable than money. He received an education from the inside of a successful trafficking operation. He learned about the airplane routes. He learned about the landing strips in the mountains, hand-cleared clearings carved out of remote terrain where small planes could land and unload. He learned about the buyers in the United States, who they were, how to contact them, how to structure deals. He learned about the bribery networks, how much to pay which officials at which level to ensure smooth operations. He learned about money laundering, how to take cash that couldn't be explained and make it look legitimate through businesses and real estate purchases. In other words, he got an MBA in drug trafficking from one of Mexico's most successful traffickers. And he was an excellent student. For several years, this arrangement continued. Felix was still officially a police officer, still drawing his federal salary, still nominally investigating trafficking. But his real education was happening on the other side. He was learning the business from the inside. Then, on September 15, 1978, Pedro Aviles Perez was killed. He died in a shootout with Mexican police forces, not officers on his payroll, but genuine law enforcement who finally caught up with him. He was in his late 30s. His organization, built over years, was suddenly leaderless. And Felix Gallardo, now 32 years old, no longer a police officer, already deep inside the trafficking world, stepped in. It was not a violent takeover. There was no coup, no assassination of rivals within Pedro's organization. Felix's approach was, as it would always be, the business approach. He spoke to Pedro's key people. He reassured them. He showed them that under his leadership, nothing would dramatically change, except that things would be better organized, better connected, and more profitable. He offered continuity and improvement simultaneously. And it worked. Pedro's people became Felix's people. Pedro's routes became Felix's routes. Pedro's contacts became Felix's contacts. At 32 years old, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo became a drug lord. Not yet a major one. Not yet the Godfather. But the foundation was laid. The empire was beginning. From the late 1970s into the early 1980s, Felix Gallardo made a series of decisions that distinguished him from virtually every other drug trafficker operating in Mexico at the time. And the most important of those decisions was about how to treat competition. Other traffickers in Sinaloa and across Mexico operated the way criminals have always operated throughout history, through violence and intimidation. You wanted someone else's route? You killed them or threatened them until they gave it up. You wanted someone else's territory? You sent gunmen to take it. It was brutal. It was constant. It was expensive in blood and money and attention from law enforcement. And it was, from a pure business perspective, catastrophically inefficient. Felix looked at this situation and saw it differently. He didn't see rivals as obstacles to eliminate. He saw potential partners whose competition was costing everyone money. He saw a fragmented market that, unified, could be exponentially more profitable for everyone involved, including himself. This was the insight that would define his career. Violence was bad for business. Cooperation was good for business. And if you could make cooperation more profitable than competition, you didn't need to threaten anyone. You just needed to show them the math. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Felix began making alliances. The most important early partnerships were with two men who would become central to everything that followed. The first was Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, universally known as Don Neto. Don Neto was older than Felix, already established in the trafficking world, respected, connected. He wasn't flashy. He was serious, intelligent, and had decades of experience in how things worked in Mexico's criminal underworld. Felix approached him with respect, acknowledging his seniority, his experience, his connections, and proposed an alliance. Don Neto saw the value immediately. Two organizations working together were more powerful than two organizations competing against each other. The second key figure was Rafael Caro Quintero, known as Rafa. Caro Quintero was younger than Felix, more aggressive, more volatile. Where Felix was diplomatic and measured, Caro Quintero was impulsive and sometimes reckless. But he was extraordinarily good at one specific thing: growing marijuana. He had a gift for large-scale agricultural operations, for managing the complex logistics of growing vast quantities of product in remote locations, for understanding which strains grew best where, for managing the workforce of hundreds of farmers necessary to produce at serious scale. Together, these three men, Felix, Don Neto, and Caro Quintero, formed what would later be called the Guadalajara Cartel, or sometimes the Guadalajara Trinity. And the city of Guadalajara was, crucially, where they chose to base their operations. Why Guadalajara? This is an important strategic choice that reveals a lot about how Felix thought. Most people assume that a drug trafficking operation would base itself as close to the action as possible, close to the growing regions, close to the border. But Felix chose Guadalajara, which is in central Mexico, nowhere near the Sinaloan mountains or the U.S. border. The reasoning was elegant. Guadalajara was Mexico's second largest city at the time, with over 1 million people. In a city that large, a wealthy businessman with a nice house, expensive cars, and a legitimate-seeming portfolio of businesses didn't attract attention. He blended in. The city also had an international airport, useful for moving money and people and eventually product. It was far enough from the action that routine border enforcement operations wouldn't accidentally stumble across the headquarters. and it was politically centralized enough that the right bribes to the right Guadalajara officials could create a bubble of protection around the operation that would be very difficult to penetrate from outside. It was, in other words, smart. It was the choice of someone who was thinking not just about today's operation but about the long-term sustainability of the organization. From their base in Guadalajara, the three men built a trafficking operation that, by the early 1980s, was moving significant quantities of marijuana and heroin into the United States, making real money, building real connections, corrupting real officials. The operation was growing. And then cocaine happened, and everything changed. To understand the scale of what happened when cocaine entered the picture, you need to understand the economics of drug trafficking before cocaine. Marijuana was profitable, but the profit per kilogram was modest, maybe $500 per kilogram at the wholesale level in the late 1970s. Heroin was much more profitable, maybe $5,000 per kilogram. These were real businesses generating real money, but they were not the extraordinary wealth-generating machines that would follow. Cocaine was different. The profit margins were extraordinary, $20,000 per kilogram or more at the wholesale level. And the demand in the United States in the late 1970s and early 1980s was exploding. The cocaine boom of the 1980s was real. From Wall Street to Hollywood to college campuses, cocaine was everywhere. The demand was almost unlimited, and the price that American consumers were willing to pay was extraordinary. But cocaine created a logistics problem. It was produced in Colombia, in the jungle laboratories operated by Pablo Escobar and the Medellin Cartel, and by the competing Cali Cartel. Colombia and the United States don't share a border. The cocaine had to travel from Colombia to the United States, and in the early 1980s, the primary route was directly through the Caribbean, through the Bahamas, through Miami, through Florida. This was the route that Pablo Escobar had developed, and for a while it worked extraordinarily well. But American law enforcement got wise. The Caribbean routes started getting hit hard. The DEA and the Coast Guard began intercepting shipments with increasing frequency. Escobar and the Medellin Cartel were losing significant quantities of product to interdiction. They needed an alternative. The alternative was Mexico. The logic was simple. Mexico shares a nearly 2,000-mile border with the United States. That border has hundreds of crossing points, official and unofficial. Established trafficking networks already operated along it for marijuana and heroin. The infrastructure existed. The corrupted officials existed. The routes existed. The only question was whether the Mexican traffickers could handle the volume and the complexity of moving cocaine, a far more valuable and tightly controlled product than marijuana. Felix Gallardo reached out to the Colombian cartels. He made a proposal that was, from their perspective, almost impossible to refuse. "You produce it," he said. "We'll move it. You pay us per kilogram for transportation. Your interdiction problem in the Caribbean disappears. Our revenue multiplies." The initial deal was around $2,000 per kilogram of cocaine successfully delivered to the U.S. border. This sounds modest given the product's value, but given the volumes they were discussing, tons, not kilograms, it translated into billions of dollars annually. And as the arrangement grew and Felix demonstrated his reliability and efficiency, it evolved. Rather than a flat transportation fee, the deal shifted to what's sometimes called payment in kind. Felix and the Federation received not cash but actual cocaine, typically somewhere around 50% of each shipment. This was transformative, because instead of being paid to move someone else's product, Felix now owned product himself. And he could sell it at the enormously profitable American wholesale price. His revenue didn't double or triple. It increased by an order of magnitude. By 1985, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo was moving more cocaine than anyone in the world other than the Colombians producing it. The quantities were staggering. Tons per month. Tons. Not kilograms. Moving through multiple routes along the U.S.-Mexico border. Into Arizona, California, Texas, New Mexico, distributed into American cities, generating billions of dollars annually. He was the most powerful drug trafficker in Mexican history, and he was about to get even more powerful. By the early 1980s, as the cocaine money was beginning to pour in, Felix Gallardo faced a problem. And the problem wasn't law enforcement. It wasn't the DEA. It wasn't the Colombian cartels. The problem was his fellow Mexican traffickers. Mexico in the early 1980s had dozens of independent drug trafficking operations. Each one had their own territory, or what they considered their territory. Each one had their own routes, their own contacts, their own networks of corrupted officials. And these organizations frequently came into conflict with each other. Territory disputes, route disputes, competition over which organization got to move product through which border crossing. Competition over which organization had the exclusive relationship with the Colombian suppliers. These conflicts were resolved in the traditional criminal way. Violence, gunfights, assassinations, kidnappings. The Sinaloan mountains and the northern Mexican border states saw regular outbreaks of cartel-on-cartel violence as different organizations fought for supremacy. And Felix, watching this from his sophisticated perspective, saw the situation for exactly what it was. A disaster. Not morally, he wasn't particularly troubled by the violence in that sense. A business disaster. Because every time two Mexican trafficking organizations went to war with each other, multiple things happened that were bad for everyone's revenue. Law enforcement attention increased. The violence caused crackdowns that disrupted operations. Shipments were delayed or seized while organizations were distracted by their internal battles. Good people, experienced pilots, drivers, accountants, logistics coordinators got killed or arrested, and their expertise was lost. The Colombian suppliers, watching this chaos from Medellin and Cali, grew nervous about the reliability of their Mexican partners. Competition was destroying potential profits. This was Felix's diagnosis, and his prescription was radical. What if they stopped competing? What if all the major Mexican trafficking organizations came together into a single coordinated structure? Not merging into one organization, that would require someone to give up their independence, and nobody would agree to that. But cooperating, sharing, working together rather than against each other. The key insight was about routes. Every trafficking organization's most valuable asset was its route, its specific path for moving product across the U.S. border. Each major crossing point, Tijuana into California, Juárez into Texas, Nogales into Arizona, was a specific, limited, enormously valuable resource. Dozens of organizations fighting over a handful of crossing points was inefficient. But if those crossing points were assigned, each organization had its assigned route and respected the other's routes, the whole system became dramatically more efficient. Less violence, less law enforcement attention, more product moved, more money made, for everyone, including, of course, Felix himself, who, as the architect and coordinator of the arrangement, would be positioned to take a cut of everything that moved through the system. The plan was elegant. The question was whether he could actually convince Mexico's proudest, most violent, most independence-minded criminal organizations to go along with it. The process by which Felix Gallardo created the Federation is one of the most remarkable organizational achievements in the history of organized crime. And it's remarkable precisely because it was not achieved through threats or violence. It was achieved through persuasion, respect, and the most fundamental of business arguments. This arrangement will make you richer than you are now. Felix began by identifying the major players. Not every drug trafficker in Mexico, there were dozens, maybe hundreds of small operations. He focused on the ones that mattered. The ones with established routes, established connections, significant volumes, real infrastructure. The ones whose cooperation would genuinely make the whole system work. Then he reached out to them one by one. He traveled. He met people on their own territory, which showed respect. He came to them rather than summoning them. He sat down. He had conversations. And he made his argument. The argument was essentially this: you are making good money. I respect that. You have built something real, and I'm not here to threaten it. I am here to show you how you can make significantly more money with significantly less risk. The risk right now, the reason our operations are interrupted, the reason we lose shipments, the reason we lose men, is that we are competing with each other. Law enforcement doesn't need to be particularly good at their job to take advantage of us when we are creating chaos for each other. But if we work together, if we each have our assigned territory and our assigned routes, and we respect each other's territory and routes, we eliminate the chaos. We eliminate the law enforcement advantage. We increase our volumes. We increase our profits. He supplemented this argument with his own growing power. By the time he was making these rounds in the early to mid-1980s, Felix had something that no other Mexican trafficker had: a direct, established, profitable relationship with the Colombian suppliers. He was the gateway to cocaine. If you wanted to participate in the cocaine boom, and you absolutely did, because that's where the money was, you needed Felix Gallardo's cooperation, which meant you needed to be part of his arrangement. This was leverage. Not violent leverage, he wasn't threatening to cut anyone off. But the implicit understanding was there. Being inside the Federation meant access to the Colombian pipeline. Being outside it meant being stuck with marijuana and heroin while the real money went elsewhere. Organization by organization, leader by leader, Felix brought them in. The structure that emerged was called La Federación, the Federation, and its organizing principle was the concept of the plaza. A plaza, in drug trafficking terminology, was a specific geographic area with access to the U.S. border. Think of it as a franchise territory. You controlled the plaza, you controlled the drug routes into the United States through that geography. You were responsible for maintaining the corruption networks in your plaza, the police, the military, the customs officials on both sides. You were responsible for the security of operations within your plaza. And in exchange, you had the exclusive right to move product through your plaza. The plazas were assigned. The Tijuana Plaza, covering the crossing points between Tijuana and San Diego, California, went to the Arellano Felix brothers. These were Felix Gallardo's own nephews, biological relatives. This was one of the most valuable plazas because of its proximity to Los Angeles and the massive California drug market. The Juárez Plaza, covering the Ciudad Juárez crossing into El Paso, Texas, was managed initially by a trafficker named Pablo Acosta and later by an extraordinarily capable man named Amado Carrillo Fuentes, who would earn the nickname Lord of the Skies for his innovative use of Boeing 727 jets to move cocaine. The Sinaloa operation, which was less a single plaza than a home territory, was managed by Felix's own lieutenants in his home state, including two men who were at this point still relatively junior figures in the organization: Joaquin Guzman, known as El Chapo, and Ismael Zambada, known as El Mayo. These men were at this point employees of the Federation system, not yet the global figures they would become. The Gulf organization, operating along the Gulf of Mexico coast and the Texas border, was run by Juan Garcia Abrego, who was connected to the most powerful political machinery in Mexico through his family ties to the ruling PRI party. And surrounding these major plazas were smaller operations, regional traffickers, organizations that handled pieces of the chain, growing, transportation, local distribution, without having the prestige of the major plaza assignments. Felix sat above all of it. Not as a direct manager of every operation, he wasn't micromanaging day-to-day shipments. He was the coordinator, the arbitrator. When disputes arose between plaza holders, and they did arise, Felix was the person who resolved them, because everyone recognized his authority and everyone respected the system he had built because it was making them all money. The Colombian cocaine flowed to Felix. He distributed loads to the various plaza holders based on capacity and routes. Each plaza holder moved their assigned loads through their assigned routes into the United States. Payment flowed back through the system, and Felix, at the center, took his cut of everything. It was, from a pure organizational standpoint, brilliant. It was also creating something that had never existed in Mexican criminal history before: a national drug trafficking organization with reach from the Pacific coast to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Sinaloan mountains to the Texas border. One system, one set of rules, an unprecedented power. By 1985, 1986, 1987, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo had achieved something that almost no criminal in history achieves. He had made himself genuinely, practically untouchable. Not because law enforcement wasn't aware of him, not because he was hiding, but because the corruption network he had built was so comprehensive, so deep, so thoroughly embedded in every layer of Mexican society and government, that the mechanisms that might normally bring someone like him down simply didn't function against him. Let's talk about the money first, because the scale of it is important for understanding how the corruption was possible. Conservative estimates place Felix Gallardo's personal wealth in the range of $500 million to $1 billion by the late 1980s. In today's inflation-adjusted terms, that's roughly $2 to $3 billion. His organization was generating revenues of several $billions per year. Think about that number. Billions. Every year. Moving through the Federation's pipelines, distributed across plaza holders, filtered through hundreds of businesses, flowing through banks invested in real estate. At this level of wealth, bribery wasn't a transaction. It was a system, a comprehensive institutional system for purchasing the loyalty, or more accurately, the cooperation, of virtually every level of Mexican government and law enforcement. The numbers, which come from DEA investigations and Mexican government prosecutions, are extraordinary. Individual police commanders were receiving $10,000 to $50,000 per month, not per year, per month, to ensure that their officers did not interfere with Federation operations. State police commanders received similar or higher amounts. Military officers, generals and colonels who controlled the units stationed in regions where the Federation operated, received hundreds of thousands of dollars annually to ensure that military operations didn't interfere with drug movements. State governors received amounts estimated in the hundreds of thousands to millions. Federal politicians, members of the Mexican Congress, cabinet ministers, figures close to the presidency, received millions. The total annual bribery budget of the Guadalajara operation was almost certainly in the hundreds of millions of dollars, which, given the billions in revenue, was simply a cost of doing business. A high cost, but affordable, and extraordinarily effective. What this meant in practice was that Felix Gallardo could host parties at his Guadalajara mansion. Parties attended by police chiefs, military commanders, local politicians, and nothing would happen. Because all of those people were already receiving their payments. They weren't his enemies. They were his business partners, albeit involuntary ones. And none of them had any incentive to disturb a system that was making them all rich. He lived like a legitimate, wealthy businessman. His Guadalajara mansion was large and well-appointed, but not ostentatiously garish in the way that some later drug lords would become notorious for. He wore expensive suits. He drove good cars. He had a wife and children, the picture of domestic normality. He had legitimate businesses, car dealerships, restaurants, nightclubs, real estate holdings. These businesses served the dual purpose of providing plausible cover for his wealth and functioning as money laundering mechanisms for the billions in drug cash. The logistics of moving cocaine at this scale were extraordinary. The Colombian cocaine was typically flown from jungle labs in Colombia to intermediate locations, sometimes small Pacific coast landing strips, sometimes Guatemala or other Central American territories, and then moved into Mexico either by air to remote airstrips or by sea to isolated coastal points. From there, it was transported inland to Guadalajara and other storage locations, repackaged, and then moved north in commercial trucks with false compartments, in legal shipments of legitimate goods with product hidden within, through corrupted customs and border agents who waved certain vehicles through without inspection, and sometimes through primitive tunnels that predated by decades the sophisticated tunnel systems that El Chapo would later perfect. The scale was something American law enforcement struggled to fully comprehend even when they were aware of it. Testimony from DA agents in congressional hearings described the realization, the dawning, horrifying realization, that they weren't dealing with big individual shipments that could be interdicted. They were dealing with a continuous flow, a river of cocaine moving through multiple channels simultaneously, such that even successful seizures barely dented the overall volume. You seized a ton here, you seized a ton there, and meanwhile 5 more tons were moving through other channels. It was like trying to stop a river with your hands. And at the center of it all, untouched, well-dressed, hosting dinner parties and attending business meetings and living the comfortable life of a successful Guadalajara businessman, sat Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. Then a DEA agent named Kiki Camarena decided to look a little closer. And the world changed. Before we go into what happened to Kiki Camarena, and we have to go into it because it's the pivot point of this entire story, I want you to understand who he actually was. Not as a symbol, not as a martyr, as a person. Enrique Kiki Camarena Salazar was born on July 26, 1947, in Mexicali, a city on the Mexican side of the U.S.-Mexico border. He was Mexican by birth, American by choice, having moved to the United States as a young child with his family and grown up in California, the agricultural Central Valley, another poor region, another place where immigrant families worked hard for modest wages. As a young man, Kiki joined the United States Marine Corps. Then, after his service, he pursued law enforcement. He worked as a police officer, and then, wanting to do more, wanting to work at the level where the problems he saw in his community actually originated, he joined the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the United States' primary federal agency for combating drug trafficking. By 1981, Kiki Camarena had been assigned to the DEA's office in Guadalajara, Mexico. He was 33 years old. He had a wife named Geneva, everyone called her Mika, and 3 young sons. He had chosen a posting that was genuinely dangerous. Guadalajara was, by 1981, the operational heart of the most powerful drug trafficking organization in Mexico. Walking around the city as a DEA agent meant walking around in the territory of the people you were investigating. The same people who had enough money to buy anyone and enough ruthlessness to kill anyone they couldn't buy. Kiki spent years in Guadalajara building a case, working slowly, methodically, the way good investigators work, building networks of informants, people inside or adjacent to the trafficking organizations who were willing to pass information for money or for protection, conducting surveillance, following money trails, analyzing intelligence, being patient. What made Kiki dangerous to Felix Gallardo wasn't that he was reckless or aggressive. It was that he was good, genuinely, uncomfortably good at his job. He was the kind of investigator who built cases on solid evidence, who turned sources inside organizations, who understood how the money moved and could follow it backward to its origin. He was methodical, he was patient, and he was getting close. DEA colleagues who knew Kiki in Guadalajara describe a man who was deeply committed to his work, not in the obsessive, single-minded way that damages personal lives, but in the way of someone who genuinely believed in what he was doing and gave it everything he had while still being a good husband and father. He was liked. He was respected. He was, by all accounts, exactly the kind of person who should be doing exactly the job he was doing. And he was closing in on the Federation in a way that was becoming impossible to ignore. The specific investigation that put Kiki Camarena on a collision course with the Federation's leadership was his discovery of Rancho Buffalo. And this is where things go from remarkable to almost unbelievable. Rancho Buffalo was a marijuana plantation located in the Chihuahuan Desert of northern Mexico, in the state of Chihuahua. But calling it a plantation almost undersells what it actually was. Rancho Buffalo was essentially an agricultural operation on industrial scale. The total area under cultivation was over 2,500 acres. To put that in perspective, 2,500 acres of marijuana. That's roughly the size of 2,000 football fields. The operation required a workforce of tens of thousands of workers at peak harvest. It had its own internal infrastructure, roads, irrigation systems, worker housing. It was essentially a small city built around the single purpose of growing the maximum possible quantity of marijuana. And the marijuana it produced was estimated to be worth, at American street prices, approximately $8 billion. $8 billion, the GDP of a small country, hidden in the Mexican desert. Rafael Caro Quintero was the primary investor and operator of Rancho Buffalo. He had conceived of it, funded it, and organized it. And for years, it had operated with the protection of local police and military, all on the payroll, all looking the other way at the right times. Kiki Camarena, through his network of informants and his careful accumulation of intelligence over years, found it. He brought his evidence to his superiors. The DEA brought pressure on the Mexican government. And in November 1984, Mexican military forces, under American pressure that was intense enough that they couldn't ignore it even if they wanted to, raided Rancho Buffalo. They destroyed it all. They burned it. Everything that Rafael Caro Quintero had invested in and built and carefully operated for years, gone. $8 billion worth of product, destroyed. Caro Quintero was apoplectic. He had lost more money in one DEA operation than most countries' government officials would make in multiple lifetimes. And he knew exactly who was responsible. Kiki Camarena. It was Camarena's investigation that had led to the raid. It was Camarena who had found the plantation. Camarena who had brought the evidence to his superiors. Camarena who had cost Rafael Caro Quintero $8 billion. Caro Quintero wanted revenge. And he wanted something else too. He wanted to know who Camarena's informants were. Who inside the organization had betrayed them. That information was worth having, and it could only be obtained one way. He went to Felix Gallardo and Don Neto. He told them what he wanted to do. And this is where the historical record becomes somewhat murky, because we don't have a recording of that conversation, and different sources interpret what followed differently. What is certain is that what Caro Quintero wanted to do was not stopped. Whether Felix approved it explicitly, approved it tacitly, or was unable to prevent a man as volatile as Caro Quintero from acting unilaterally is a question that lawyers and historians continue to debate. What happened next, however, is not in question. February 7, 1985, 12:30 in the afternoon, Guadalajara. Kiki Camarena was leaving the U.S. consulate in Guadalajara for a lunch appointment with his wife. He had just finished a meeting inside. The afternoon was ordinary. The street outside was busy with the normal midday traffic of a large Mexican city. 5 men approached him. They were not subtle about it. They grabbed him, forced him into a waiting vehicle, and drove away. Other DEA agents who were in the area saw what happened. They saw Kiki being forced into the car. They tried to respond, but it was too fast. Within seconds, the vehicle carrying Kiki Camarena was gone, lost in Guadalajara's traffic. The location where Kiki was taken was Rafael Caro Quintero's residence in Guadalajara, a house in an upscale neighborhood, a house where DEA investigators would later establish the local police, paid by Caro Quintero, had blocked off access roads to prevent anyone from interfering with what was happening inside. The Guadalajara police were not witnesses to this crime. They were participants. They had been paid to facilitate it. Inside the house, what happened to Kiki Camarena over the next 30 hours is among the most disturbing documented episodes in DEA history. I'm going to tell you what happened factually because it's documented, because it's part of the historical record, and because the people responsible for it should be named and what they did should be acknowledged. But I'm going to be restrained in the description, because Kiki Camarena was a real person with a real family, and his suffering deserves to be treated with gravity rather than sensation. He was interrogated. They wanted to know about his informants who inside the Federation had been talking to the DEA. They wanted to know what the DEA knew, what investigations were underway, what was coming. They had a doctor present, literally, a medical doctor whose job was to keep Kiki alive and conscious so that the interrogation could continue. The doctor administered drugs that kept him alert enough to respond. The torture lasted more than 30 hours, February 7th into February 8th. Kiki Camarena died on February 8, 1985, from the injuries he sustained during that period. He was 37 years old. He had a wife and 3 sons. He had come to Guadalajara to do his job, to try to stop the people who were poisoning his country with drugs, and he died for it. His body was wrapped and transported from Guadalajara to a rural area in the neighboring state of Michoacán. It was found there on March 5, 1985, nearly a month after he was killed, by Mexican authorities, badly decomposed. The DEA investigators later found something that made the whole case even more horrifying. The torture had been recorded. There were tapes, audio recordings of what had happened to Kiki during those 30-plus hours. The recordings were evidence. The cartel had made them to document what Kiki told them, to have a record of his admissions. Those recordings were later recovered by investigators. DEA agents who heard them described the experience as devastating. Kiki's screams, his voice, the questions being asked and the methods being used to force answers. Those tapes are part of the evidentiary record of this case. One other person was taken alongside Kiki and suffered a similar fate. His Mexican pilot, a man named Alfredo Zavala Avalar. He was killed as well. He is often overlooked in the telling of this story but deserves to be acknowledged. When a DEA agent is murdered, the DEA responds. That is an institutional promise, a matter of agency culture and identity. But what happened after Kiki Camarena's murder was not just the normal institutional response amplified. It was something qualitatively different, something that hadn't happened before. The murder of an American DEA agent on foreign soil, tortured for 30 hours and killed, was treated by the United States government as something close to an act of war. The operation that was launched was called Operation Leyenda. Leyenda means legend in Spanish. The choice of that word was deliberate. It was a tribute to Kiki. They were calling him a legend. and the operation conducted in his name was the largest DEA homicide investigation in the agency's history. Over 100 DEA agents were assigned to the case. The budget was essentially unlimited. When Congress and the Justice Department are motivated, money appears. The mission was total. Find every single person involved in Kiki Camarena's kidnapping, torture, and murder, and bring them to justice. The United States government also applied political pressure on Mexico at a level that was almost unprecedented for a peacetime relationship between neighboring allies. The U.S. threatened economic sanctions. The U.S. Border Patrol and Customs began Operation Camarena, a deliberate, aggressive slowdown of traffic at every U.S.-Mexico border crossing. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was economic warfare. The U.S.-Mexico border crossing is one of the busiest international boundaries in the world, and commercial traffic through it is the lifeblood of enormous amounts of economic activity on both sides. Deliberately slowing that traffic to near standstill sent an unmistakable message. The United States was angry, and it was willing to cause economic pain to get what it wanted. What it wanted was arrests. The Mexican government, which had its own deeply complicated relationship with the trafficking world, including figures in government who were on Felix's payroll, nevertheless understood that this pressure could not be ignored. The murder of Kiki Camarena had created a political crisis that threatened Mexico's relationship with its most important trading partner and security ally. The arrests began relatively quickly, at least for some of the most directly involved parties. In April 1985, Rafael Caro Quintero was located in Costa Rica, where he had fled after the kidnapping. DEA pressure on Costa Rican authorities led to his arrest and extradition to Mexico. He was charged with the murder of Kiki Camarena and the murder of Alfredo Zavala Avelar. He was convicted and sentenced to 40 years in Mexican prison. He was controversially released in 2013 on a legal technicality after serving 28 years, which caused fury in the U.S. He was rearrested in 2022 following a U.S. extradition request, and the legal proceedings around his case are still ongoing. In the same period, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, Don Neto, was arrested in Mexico. He too was charged in connection with the Camarena murder. He was convicted and sentenced to 40 years. Now in his late 80s, he has been placed under house arrest due to his age and deteriorating health. But Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo? He was not arrested. Not in 1985. Not in 1986. Not in 1987. Not in 1988. For 4 years after Kiki Camarena's murder, Felix Gallardo continued to operate. The Federation continued to function. Cocaine continued to flow. He was still too connected, still too deeply embedded in Mexico's political and law enforcement establishment, still too valuable as a source of bribe money to too many powerful people for any of them to allow his arrest. The United States knew this. The DEA knew this. They continued building their case. They continued applying pressure. They continued gathering evidence. And they waited. The question of exactly how directly involved Felix Gallardo was in the decision to kidnap and kill Kiki Camarena has been debated in courts and in books for decades. What is established is that the kidnapping happened in Guadalajara, where Felix was the dominant criminal authority. That local police, who were on his payroll, participated in blocking access to the location where Kiki was held. That events of this magnitude in the Federation's territory did not happen without the knowledge and at minimum the tacit approval of the organization's leader. Mexican courts have found him responsible. He denies it from prison to this day. But regardless of the precise degree of his personal involvement in that specific decision, what is not in dispute is that he led the organization within which it happened, that his lieutenants carried it out, and that his bribery network made it possible. The consequences of that, for Kiki's family, for Mexico, for the 400,000 people who have died in subsequent cartel violence, flow from that. For 4 years after Kiki Camarena's murder, Felix Gallardo maintained his position. The Federation continued operating. The cocaine continued flowing. He continued living in his Guadalajara mansion, attending his business meetings, hosting his dinner parties. He changed locations more frequently, more cautious than before, aware that American pressure was ongoing. But he was still free, still in control, still the Godfather. By 1989, the political situation had changed enough that his protection became insufficient. A new Mexican president, Carlos Salinas de Gortari, had come to power in 1988. His relationship with the United States was, in his political calculations, more important to protect than the relationships with the trafficking world that his predecessors had tolerated. The American pressure, for years of it, unrelenting, backed by genuine economic consequences, had finally reached a level that required visible action. Felix Gallardo was, in the cold calculus of Mexican political realpolitik, sacrificable. The people above him, the politicians and government figures who had benefited from his money but whose political futures depended on maintaining American goodwill, decided they could no longer protect him. He was offered up. On April 8, 1989, Mexican federal judicial police officers arrested Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo at his home in Guadalajara. He was 43 years old. He was dressed well, as always. He did not resist. He was taken into custody without violence. The man who had spent years making himself untouchable was now in handcuffs. The charges included drug trafficking, undeniable, given the scale of his operations, and conspiracy in the murder of Kiki Camarena, which he denied and continues to deny. He was taken to Altiplano Prison, one of Mexico's maximum security federal prisons, and he has not been a free man since that day. As of the time of this video, he has been in prison for 37 years. He is 80 years old. He is blind, having lost his vision to a combination of diabetes, age, and inadequate medical care in prison. He has serious heart problems. He uses a wheelchair. He is, by any measure, a dying old man in a prison cell. But here's the thing about his arrest. Here's the part that makes this story truly, devastatingly different from any other drug lord story. Arresting Felix Gallardo didn't end the Mexican drug world. It didn't even particularly disrupt it. What it did, and this is the central tragedy of everything that followed, was remove the one person who had the authority, the relationships, and the intelligence to keep the peace among the organizations that would become the modern cartels. The Federation without Felix Gallardo was like a corporation that had just lost the only executive capable of managing all the competing divisions simultaneously. The divisions didn't disappear. They didn't merge into something more coherent. They became independent, and independent organizations in criminal markets don't cooperate. They compete, and when criminal organizations compete, people die. But before the chaos fully erupted, Felix made one last attempt to manage the transition. He called a meeting. In 1989, sometime after his arrest, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo sat in his prison cell at Altiplano and made arrangements that would have seemed impossible for any other prisoner in Mexico. He arranged for the leaders of his various Federation organizations to come to the prison and meet with him. That this happened is documented. That prison officials allowed it, presumably because enough of them were either still on cartel payroll or simply too intimidated to refuse, tells you something about the state of Mexican institutions in 1989. That the leaders of what would become some of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world traveled to a prison to meet with their imprisoned boss tells you something about his continuing authority even behind bars. The meeting assembled the major figures of what had been the Federation. There was some version of every significant leadership group present. The Arellano Felix brothers, Felix's own nephews, his blood relatives, the men he had placed in control of the Tijuana territory. Amado Carrillo Fuentes, who was emerging as the dominant figure in the Juárez operation and who would soon earn the nickname Lord of the Skies for his innovations in aerial drug transportation. Joaquin Guzman, El Chapo, a relatively young man at this point, 32 years old, who had worked his way up through the Sinaloa operation and was respected as capable and ambitious. Ismael El Mayo Zambada, older and more experienced, who would prove to be one of the most durable criminal figures in history. As of this recording, El Mayo is still operational, still never having been successfully prosecuted inside Mexico. Juan Garcia Abrego, representing the Gulf organization. These were not minor figures. These were the people who would, in the decade following this meeting, kill thousands of people, who would corrupt institutions, who would control territories, who would become the founders of the cartel world that exists today. And they were sitting in a prison, listening to their imprisoned boss explain what would happen next. Felix's decision was based on a simple recognition. He wasn't getting out. He knew his legal situation was permanent. He knew the Federation needed a new structure to survive. and the structure he proposed was the one that already, in a sense, existed, the plaza system. Each organization had its assigned territory. Each would continue to operate within that territory independently. There would be no central coordination because there was no longer a central coordinator. But the territorial assignments that had been the foundation of the Federation's peace would continue as a framework. The division, as Felix arranged it, went something like this. The Tijuana Plaza, the border crossing from Baja California into California, to the Arellano Felix brothers. This was consistent with the arrangement that had existed under the Federation. The Arellano brothers were Felix's own relatives, and they had been building their Tijuana operation for years already. The Juárez Plaza, the Ciudad Juárez crossing into El Paso, Texas, to Amado Carrillo Fuentes. Amado was, by 1989, already the most capable operational figure in the Juárez organization, and his ascension to undisputed control was a natural continuation. The Sinaloa territory, the home region, the mountains and valleys and coastal areas of northwestern Mexico, to El Chapo and El Mayo and the other figures who had been building the Sinaloa operation under the Federation umbrella. This was the territory that would eventually host the most powerful cartel in the world. The Gulf territory, the northeastern Mexican states bordering Texas along the Gulf of Mexico, to Juan Garcia Abrego and the organization that would eventually become the Gulf Cartel. The logic was the same logic that had built the Federation in the first place. Each organization gets its own territory. Each respects the other's territory. Peace is maintained. Business continues. No one fights because everyone has enough. The fatal flaw was the same flaw that makes peace in the absence of enforcement impossible. The Federation had maintained peace because Felix Gallardo existed to enforce the rules. When disputes arose, he resolved them. When someone stepped out of line, he had the authority and the resources to bring them back. He was the enforcement mechanism. Without him, there was no enforcement mechanism. The territorial divisions were suggestions, not laws. And criminal organizations don't respect suggestions for very long. Felix Gallardo, sitting in his prison cell, had done the most rational thing he could think of in his situation. He had tried to ensure an orderly transition. He had tried to prevent chaos. He had tried, even in prison, to manage the outcome. He failed. Not because he was unintelligent, but because the system he had built was fundamentally dependent on his personal authority, and no institutional structure could replace that authority once he was removed. The meeting ended. The leaders went back to their territories, and within months the fighting began. The transformation from the Federation to the modern cartel world did not happen overnight. It happened gradually, then catastrophically, the way many disasters unfold, slowly building pressure until the explosion. In the immediate aftermath of Felix's arrest and the prison meeting, the organizations continued operating more or less according to the established patterns. The pipelines existed. The Colombian supply continued. The routes continued. The bribed officials continued receiving their payments. The business of moving cocaine into the United States continued. But the tensions that Felix had always managed, the territorial disputes, the competition over specific routes, the resentments that accumulate when different organizations are operating in close proximity, no longer had anyone to resolve them. They accumulated, they festered, and they eventually exploded. The first and perhaps most violent of the emerging cartels was the Tijuana Cartel, the Arellano Felix organization. The Arellano Felix brothers, there were 7 brothers involved in the operation, took the Tijuana territory that their uncle had given them and built something extraordinary and extraordinarily brutal. They became famous or infamous for the savage violence of their enforcement tactics. They didn't just kill rivals. They killed rivals and their families. They killed anyone who might testify against them. They killed journalists who reported on them. They killed a Catholic cardinal, Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, in 1993, in what appeared to be a case of mistaken identity at the Guadalajara airport. The killing of a cardinal shocked even Mexico, which by then was becoming somewhat numb to cartel violence. The Tijuana Cartel controlled some of the most valuable drug crossing points into California, and they defended that control with extraordinary ferocity throughout the 1990s. The Juárez Cartel, under Amado Carrillo Fuentes, took a different approach. Amado was, by many accounts, a genuine operational genius. He recognized that the primary limitation on cocaine smuggling across the Mexican border was the physical capacity to move large quantities undetected. His solution was audacious. He acquired and modified Boeing 727 passenger jets to carry cocaine shipments. A 727 can carry enormous quantities of freight. Amato's modified 727s, stripped of passenger fittings and fitted with extra fuel tanks, could fly from Colombia directly to remote Mexican airstrips, carrying cocaine in quantities that dwarfed anything previously moved by light aircraft. This innovation earned him his nickname, Lord of the Skies. At his peak in the mid-1990s, Amato Carrillo Fuentes was arguably the wealthiest and most powerful drug trafficker in the world. Some estimates placed his personal fortune at $25 billion. The Mexican government considered him so dangerous that they essentially offered a truce, a tacit arrangement where they wouldn't aggressively pursue him as long as the violence stayed at manageable levels. Then, in 1997, Amato Carrillo Fuentes did something that revealed the strange fragility of even the most powerful cartel kingpin's position. He decided to change his appearance to evade recognition. He underwent extensive plastic surgery, and he died on the operating table in a Mexico City clinic on July 4, 1997, apparently from complications of the surgery combined with excessive sedation. He was 40 years old. The Sinaloa operation, the territory assigned to El Chapo and El Mayo, would prove to be the most durable of all. El Chapo, Joaquin Guzman, grew the Sinaloa operation steadily through the 1990s, first competing with the Tijuana Cartel for routes and then, in a series of bloody conflicts, decisively defeating them. He was first arrested in 1993, convicted, and sent to maximum security prison, from which he escaped in 2001, reportedly hidden in a laundry cart. He spent years as a fugitive, building his organization, expanding his routes. He was recaptured in 2014. He escaped again through a sophisticated tunnel in 2015. He was recaptured for the final time in 2016, extradited to the United States in 2017, convicted on multiple charges in a New York federal trial in 2019, and sentenced to life plus 30 years. He is currently in ADX Florence, the Supermax facility in Colorado. El Mayo Zambada Ismael Zambada Garcia is the other half of the Sinaloa leadership. He is now 76 years old. He has never, in his entire career, spent a day in prison inside Mexico. He is one of the most extraordinary figures in the history of organized crime, a man who built and maintained a criminal empire for decades while remaining largely in the shadows, never seeking the fame that destroyed many of his contemporaries. He was arrested in the United States in July 2024 under controversial circumstances. There are allegations that he was lured to American territory under false pretenses, and his legal situation is ongoing. The Gulf Cartel, the organization operating along the Gulf Coast, took a fateful turn in the late 1990s that would have consequences echoing throughout all subsequent Mexican cartel history. Struggling to deal with rivals and with law enforcement, the Gulf Cartel made a decision to hire military muscle. They recruited members of the Mexican Army's elite Special Forces unit, the GAFES, to serve as their enforcement wing. These military-trained killers brought to cartel violence a discipline, tactical sophistication, and capacity for extreme brutality that had not existed before. They were called Los Zetas, and Los Zetas would eventually become their own independent cartel, more violent, more militarized, more tactically sophisticated than anything Mexican law enforcement was prepared to handle. By the early 2000s, Mexico had multiple powerful, independent, mutually hostile cartel organizations controlling different territories and fighting each other constantly for expansion. The careful system of territorial assignments that Felix had tried to establish was a distant memory. The violence was escalating. Then, in 2006, came the event that turned a serious problem into what can only be described as a catastrophe. Before we go to the scale of the violence that followed, let's return to the man himself. Because part of what makes this story so unsettling is the contrast between what Felix Gallardo is now, a sick, blind old man in a prison cell, and the scale of what his decisions set in motion. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo has been in Altiplano Federal Prison since his arrest in 1989. Altiplano is Mexico's highest security federal prison, located in the state of Mexico not far from Mexico City. It is where Mexico sends the people it most needs to contain, or needed to, before El Chapo's famous tunnel escape from a different facility in 2015 somewhat undermined confidence in the system. For the first years of his imprisonment, Felix continued to exercise some influence over the outside world. He gave instructions. He received visitors. He maintained enough connection to his former organization that he wasn't simply irrelevant. But over time, as the cartel landscape fractured and evolved, as new leaders arose who had no personal loyalty to him, as his direct connections faded, his practical influence diminished. He gave several interviews over the years to Mexican journalists and researchers who managed to gain access. In these interviews, his position has been fairly consistent. He acknowledges drug trafficking. He is not in a position to deny it. The evidence is overwhelming and the convictions are on the record. But he denies personal involvement in the murder of Kiki Camarena. He insists that Caro Quintero acted unilaterally, without his knowledge or approval. He insists that he was not told about the kidnapping until it was already underway, and that he did not authorize it. Whether you believe him on this point is a matter of judgment. Mexican courts have found him responsible. DEA investigators and the American government believe he was involved. His own defenders argue that Caro Quintero, volatile and furious over the loss of Rancho Buffalo, acted without proper authorization. The truth, at this distance, may be impossible to establish with certainty. What's more interesting, perhaps, is his perspective on the broader consequences of his arrest. In various interviews, he has made a statement that is, on its face, accurate. He has said, in various formulations, "I united them. Whoever divided them created the violence." He is arguing, with some historical justification, that the Federation under his leadership was peaceful, that the cartels only became the war machines they are because they were separated after his arrest, that the post-1989 violence is the result of the division, not of the unification. He is correct that the Federation was more peaceful than what followed. He is correct that his arrest was the trigger for the fragmentation. But the counterargument that most historians and analysts make, is that a criminal peace maintained by bribery and personal authority is not a sustainable peace. It is a peace that depends entirely on one person's ability to manage it, and it was always going to shatter the moment that person was removed. The question was not whether it would collapse. It was when. And the larger moral question, whether a peace that existed to facilitate the movement of billions of dollars worth of cocaine into the United States constitutes a good peace in any meaningful sense, is one that Felix's framing conveniently avoids. Today, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo is 80 years old. His vision is gone. He is completely blind, the result of a combination of diabetes, deteriorating health conditions, and decades of inadequate medical care in a maximum security prison. He has significant cardiac problems. He uses a wheelchair. His family has repeatedly petitioned for his release on humanitarian grounds, arguing that he is too sick and too old to be a danger to anyone, and that keeping him in prison amounts to a cruel prolongation of what is already effectively a life sentence of suffering. The Mexican government has, so far, declined. Every day that he sits in that cell, the organizations that emerged from the meeting he called in 1989 continue their operations. People continue to die in Mexico's ongoing cartel wars. Fentanyl, produced by cartel-connected operations, continues to kill tens of thousands of Americans every year. And the system that he built, that he is, in a real sense, the architect of, continues to function, evolved far beyond anything he could have imagined or controlled, but built on the foundation he laid. Kiki Camarena died in February 1985. He has been dead for 40 years. And in some ways, his influence on American culture and policy has grown rather than diminished in the decades since his murder. The most visible manifestation of his legacy is Red Ribbon Week. Every October, schools across the United States observe Red Ribbon Week, a nationally recognized anti-drug campaign. The red ribbon is worn to honor Kiki Camarena. Students wear red. They make pledges about drug-free living. They learn about the consequences of drug trafficking. The week began in 1988, just 3 years after Kiki's death, when a California legislator named Curt Weldon proposed the national observance. Today, it reaches tens of millions of American students every year. Think about that. A DEA agent who died in Guadalajara in 1985 is commemorated by schoolchildren across America every October. His sacrifice is embedded in American educational culture in a way that very few law enforcement deaths ever achieve. Kiki Camarena, Mika, Kiki's widow, has been an advocate for anti-drug efforts and for the memory of her husband for decades. She has appeared at Red Ribbon Week events, spoken to legislators, and kept Kiki's story alive in the public consciousness. She has watched the legal proceedings against the men responsible for her husband's death span multiple decades, Caro Quintero's release and rearrest, the continuing investigation into others involved, the ongoing questions about the full extent of official Mexican complicity. Within the DEA, Kiki Camarena is essentially a sacred figure. His name is invoked as the example of what DEA agents risk. Operation Leyenda, the investigation launched in his name, remains one of the defining moments in the agency's institutional history. The lesson the DEA drew from his death was not caution. It was commitment. The agency's operations in Mexico expanded after his murder, not contracted. American law enforcement presence in and around Mexico intensified. The intelligence networks improved, and the legal reckoning is still not complete. Cases connected to Kiki's murder have wound through Mexican and American courts for 4 decades. Rafael Caro Quintero, one of the most directly responsible figures, is still legally contested, arrested again in 2022 on a U.S. extradition warrant, fighting those proceedings in Mexican courts. The full accountability that Kiki's family and the DEA have sought for 40 years remains, in certain respects, incomplete. Everything we've discussed so far, the rise of Felix Gallardo, the Federation, the Kiki Camarena murder, the arrest, the prison meeting, the birth of the modern cartels, all of it was prologue to what began in December 2006. Because that's when the violence truly exploded into something that the world had never seen from a neighboring country at peace with the United States. In December 2006, newly inaugurated Mexican President Felipe Calderón, facing a legitimacy crisis following a contested election, made a decision that transformed the cartel conflict. He deployed the Mexican military directly against the cartels, not as a support element for law enforcement, as a direct combatant force. Soldiers, tanks, military intelligence directly engaged with cartel organizations across Mexico. The cartels responded, not by surrendering or backing down, but by escalating. They had, by 2006, spent 15 years since Felix's prison meeting building military-grade enforcement capacity. Los Zetas had brought genuine military training into the cartel world. Other organizations had followed. They had heavy weapons, automatic rifles, RPGs, sometimes military vehicles. They had tactical training. They had intelligence networks. And they had essentially unlimited money to recruit fighters. The resulting conflict has killed over 400,000 people since 2006. Let me try to make that number real for a moment, because statistics of this magnitude are easy to absorb without actually feeling them. 400,000 people. More deaths than the Korean War. More deaths than the Vietnam War. The population of a mid-sized American city. All of them dead in drug war violence in Mexico over the past 18 years. Many of them were cartel members, soldiers, or police officers, but many of them were civilians, people who had nothing to do with drug trafficking, caught in crossfire, or targeted by cartels for other reasons, because they were witnesses, because they were journalists, because they were officials who refused to be bribed, because they were simply in the wrong place. 100,000 or more people have disappeared, not confirmed dead, but missing. Mass graves continue to be discovered across Mexico, sometimes containing hundreds of bodies. In some states and cities, the government effectively cedes territorial control to cartel organizations during periods of intense conflict. The human cost is compounded by what this violence has done to Mexican society more broadly. Journalism in Mexico is one of the most dangerous professions in the world. More journalists have been killed in Mexico over the past 2 decades than in almost any other country on Earth, including active war zones. The press freedom that is essential to democratic accountability has been profoundly compromised in regions where cartels operate. Local governance in many parts of Mexico has been hollowed out. Mayors and municipal officials receive threats or bribes, sometimes simultaneously, and often comply or flee rather than resist. Some communities have formed self-defense groups, armed civilian militias, to protect themselves when both the government and the cartel have failed them. The flow of drugs into the United States continues. It has never stopped. It has adapted to every law enforcement innovation, every interdiction campaign, every political initiative on either side of the border. When the Colombian cocaine routes were disrupted, the cartels shifted to methamphetamine. When methamphetamine enforcement increased, they developed fentanyl, far more potent, far easier to produce, far more profitable per kilogram, and capable of being produced entirely within Mexico without dependence on Colombian suppliers. Fentanyl is now responsible for more American drug overdose deaths than any other substance. Over 80,000 Americans died of fentanyl overdoses in 2022 alone. The cartels produce and distribute the overwhelming majority of it. The Sinaloa Cartel remains, by most assessments, the most powerful cartel operating in Mexico and beyond. It operates in dozens of countries. It has distribution networks in European cities. It has connections to drug markets in Asia and Australia. It is, in every meaningful sense, a global criminal enterprise that began in the mountains of Sinaloa and grew through the organizational structures that Felix Gallardo pioneered. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, is the most powerful emerging force, led by a man named Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, known as El Mencho, who has been on the DEA's most wanted list for years. CJNG has challenged Sinaloa's dominance in multiple regions and is responsible for some of the most brazen violence of recent years, including shooting down a military helicopter with a rocket-propelled grenade. These organizations, all of them in different ways, direct descendants of the federation structure that Felix Gallardo created, operate today. People are dying today in Mexico because of the territorial competition between these organizations. Fentanyl is killing Americans today because of the production capacity these organizations have developed. The machine runs on, and the man who first assembled it sits blind and sick in a prison cell, 80 years old, having spent 37 years watching from behind walls as the thing he built grew into something he never intended and almost certainly never imagined. Narcos Mexico premiered on Netflix in 2018 and ran for 3 seasons, concluding in 2021. It was produced by the same team behind the original Narcos series, which covered Pablo Escobar and the Colombian cartels. The show starred Diego Luna as Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, with an ensemble cast covering all the major figures of the era. The show's production team did genuine research. They consulted with DEA agents who had been stationed in Mexico during the period. They worked with Mexican investigators and journalists. They had access to materials from the Narcos archive that had been built during the original series. The result was a show that, while it takes the creative liberties that all dramatizations must take, gets a surprising number of things genuinely right. Let's start with what they got right, because there's quite a bit. Felix's background and rise. The show depicts Felix as a former police officer who transitions into trafficking through his connections and his intelligence. This is accurate. The specific detail, federal judicial police working in Sinaloa, making contacts with traffickers through his law enforcement role, is documented. The show captures correctly the fundamental nature of what made Felix different from other traffickers. He was a businessman and a diplomat, not a soldier. Diego Luna's performance conveys this effectively. He plays Felix as someone who is always calculating, always thinking several moves ahead, always preferring the elegant solution to the violent one. The Federation. The core concept of the Federation, that Felix was the person who united previously competing Mexican drug trafficking organizations into a cooperative structure, is accurate. This is one of the most important historical facts about Mexican cartel history, and the show gives it the attention it deserves. The depiction of Felix traveling around Mexico, meeting with various traffickers, making his argument for cooperation and profit sharing, this reflects what the historical record suggests actually happened. The personalities. The characterizations of the major figures are broadly accurate. Rafael Caro Quintero as volatile, impulsive, and willing to make reckless decisions is consistent with what investigators and researchers describe. Don Neto Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, as the older, wiser, more cautious voice within the leadership, is consistent with accounts from people who knew him. And El Chapo's depiction as a capable but junior figure in the Federation hierarchy during this period is historically accurate. He was not yet the dominant figure he would become. Kiki Camarena. The show's depiction of Kiki, played by Michael Pena, is one of its strongest elements. Kiki is shown as dedicated, intelligent, family-oriented, and genuinely committed to his work. This matches what DEA colleagues and people who knew him describe. The investigation he conducted, including the discovery of Rancho Buffalo, is depicted accurately. The kidnapping and its aftermath are addressed with appropriate gravity. DEA agents who knew the real Kiki have generally confirmed that Michael Pena's portrayal captured the man's character effectively. Rancho Buffalo. The show depicts this accurately. The plantation's massive scale, its operation under cartel management with military protection, and its destruction following DEA pressure are all documented events. The show gets the essential details right. The corruption. The show's depiction of institutional corruption in Mexico is accurate. The systematic bribery of police, military, and political figures that made the Federation's operations possible is shown throughout the series without minimizing its scope. This is important because understanding the corruption is essential to understanding how the organization survived for as long as it did. The arrest and the division. The show's final season depicts Felix's arrest in 1989 and his subsequent division of Mexico's territories among his lieutenants. The prison meeting, dramatized with some fictional elements added for tension, captures the essential historical event accurately. The territories assigned to various organizations in the show reflect the actual territorial divisions that the historical record documents. These are substantial things to get right. The show's basic narrative spine, Felix's rise, the Federation, the Kiki murder, the arrest, the division, is historically accurate in its broad outlines. Now for the parts where Netflix diverged from reality. Some of these are understandable creative choices. Some are significant historical distortions. And some are simply the inevitable result of turning decades of complex history into a television drama. Felix's personal violence. This is probably the most significant historical distortion in the show. Diego Luna's Felix personally kills people in several scenes throughout the series. He shoots people. He participates directly in violence. The show presents him as someone who, when necessary, picks up a weapon and uses it. The real Felix Gallardo almost certainly never personally killed anyone. This is not me making him out to be better than he was. He absolutely ordered deaths, absolutely ran an organization that routinely used violence, absolutely bears moral responsibility for every killing done in the service of his operation. But he didn't do it personally. He was a boss, not a soldier. He hired violence out. He was a businessman who understood that getting personally involved in violence was bad for his image and his operations. The show needed its protagonist to be capable of action sequences. The real Felix Gallardo's way of dealing with problems was to make phone calls and arrange meetings, not to pick up a gun. The compressed timeline. The show takes events that unfolded over roughly 15 years, from Felix's rise in the late 1970s through his arrest in 1989, and compresses them into 3 seasons of television. The result is that things feel like they happen much faster than they actually did. Felix's rise to dominance took years of careful relationship building, gradual corruption of institutions, slow accumulation of power. The show, by necessity, suggests a speed of events that slightly distorts the patient, methodical reality. The Kiki torture. The show depicts the torture and murder of Kiki Camarena but is, by television standards, even premium streaming, considerably restrained in what it shows. The reality, documented in the DEA case files and on the recordings that investigators later recovered, was significantly worse than anything the show depicts. 30+ hours. A doctor keeping the victim alive to extend the interrogation. The specifics of what was done are in the historical record. The show couldn't show them and shouldn't show them in the graphic detail they occurred. But viewers should understand that the show's depiction, disturbing as it is, represents a substantial softening of the documented reality. Isabella Bautista. This character, a female journalist and activist who becomes significant in the show's narrative, is a composite creation. She didn't exist as depicted. She appears to be constructed from elements of several real journalists and activists who operated in Mexico during the period, but the character herself is fictional. This is a common technique in dramatization, creating composite characters to serve narrative purposes, but it should be noted, the political complexity. The show simplifies the relationship between the Mexican government, the ruling PRI party, and the trafficking organizations. In reality, the connections were significantly more complex and significantly deeper than the show conveys. The PRI had governed Mexico as a single-party state for nearly 60 years by the time Felix was arrested. In that context, the relationship between political power and organized crime was not just one of bribery and corruption, it was structural, systematic, and had developed over generations. The show captures the surface of this but not the full depth. What happens after the arrest? This is, in many ways, the show's greatest limitation, and it's not really the showrunner's fault. They had to end somewhere. Season 3 covers the 1990s, and the show concludes without showing the full scope of what followed. The 400,000 deaths since 2006, the emergence of fentanyl, Los Zetas and their military-style violence, CJNG, the complete failure of multiple Mexican government campaigns against the cartels, the corruption of military officials who were supposed to combat trafficking, the massacre of Mexican civilians by cartel gunmen that make headlines regularly. This is the story the show doesn't tell, and it's the most important story. Because the deaths happened, the suffering happened, the communities destroyed happened, and they all happened because of the structure that Felix Gallardo built and then left behind when he went to prison. The prison meeting. The show dramatizes the prison meeting with significant tension and drama. It's presented as a charged, emotionally intense encounter between powerful figures at a crossroads. The reality was probably considerably less cinematic. We don't have a transcript of the actual meeting. We don't have recordings. What we have is the result, the territorial division that followed, and the accounts of people who were later involved in the organizations that emerged. The show extrapolates backwards from the outcome to construct a plausible scene. This is fine as dramatization goes, but it's worth noting that the specific details of that meeting, who said exactly how the territories were negotiated, what the atmosphere was like, are not documented in the way that, say, Kiki's kidnapping is documented. The show is genuinely good television. The research behind it is real. The historical core is sound. But as with all dramatizations, the viewer who wants to understand what actually happened needs to supplement the screen version with the historical record, which is what this video is for. There is one truth about what Felix Gallardo created that television drama is almost structurally incapable of conveying. And it's the truth that makes this story, in my view, more disturbing than the Pablo Escobar story, and the Pablo Escobar story is enormously disturbing. Escobar killed through terrorism. He sent car bombs. He ordered assassinations of specific targets, judges, politicians, police chiefs, journalists. He killed probably 4,000 to 5,000 people through directed violence during his years of open war against the Colombian state. This is horrific. This is unforgivable. But it is comprehensible. It has the logic of a single, specific, purposeful violent actor choosing to use violence as a political weapon. What Felix Gallardo created is different. He created a system, an organizational system, a set of structures, relationships, territorial arrangements, and operational protocols that, once set in motion, operated independently of any single individual's choices. When Felix went to prison and the Federation fragmented into competing cartels, those cartels continued to operate according to the structural logic he had established: competition for territory, control of routes, corruption of institutions. The violence that resulted was not directed by Felix. He was in prison. It was generated by the structure itself, by the competition inherent in the fragmented territorial model he had created and then been unable to manage from behind bars. 400,000 people dead. And almost none of those deaths were ordered by Felix Gallardo. He was in prison for all of them. He has been in prison for all of them. But the system he built, the organizational template, the territorial model, the institutional corruption infrastructure, is the container within which all of that violence happened. The cartels that killed those people are all, in one way or another, organizational descendants of the structure he created. This is what the show cannot fully convey, because the show ends before most of the killing happens. Because the show is a story about one man and one era, and the consequences of that era spill into decades the show doesn't depict. And because drama requires individual agency, we need to see characters making choices and experiencing consequences. The diffuse, structural violence of 400,000 cartel-related deaths doesn't fit neatly into any dramatic form. But it is the truth, and understanding it is why this story matters. Let me tell you the complete story one final time, start to finish, so it sits in your mind the way it should. A boy is born in 1946 in Culiacan, Sinaloa. He grows up poor in a state that is becoming slowly and almost inevitably the center of Mexican drug production. He is smart, exceptionally smart. He is charming. He is observant. He watches the world around him and understands, from an early age, how power actually works versus how it is supposed to work. He becomes a police officer, federal judicial police, and in doing so, he puts himself at the center of the spider web, not as a trafficker but as the officer responsible for investigating traffickers. He watches, he learns, he builds relationships on both sides of the law simultaneously. He understands the corruption ecosystem from the inside of the institution that is supposed to stop it. He meets Pedro Aviles Perez, the first real drug lord of Sinaloa, a pioneer who used airplanes before anyone else, who showed what was possible. And Felix, instead of arresting him, makes an arrangement, takes his money, learns his business, becomes his student. In 1978, Pedro Aviles is killed in a shootout. Felix is 32 years old. He steps in, takes over, and begins building something of his own. Something different. He doesn't fight rivals. He talks to them. He brings Ernesto Fonseca, Don Neto into partnership. Then Rafael Caro Quintero. The three of them establish themselves in Guadalajara, start trafficking marijuana and heroin, build the corruption networks, grow. Then cocaine arrives. Pablo Escobar in Colombia needs a new route into America. The Caribbean routes are getting hit too hard. Felix Gallardo sees the opportunity. He reaches out to the Colombians. "We'll move your cocaine through Mexico into the United States," he says. "Pay us per kilo. Or better yet, pay us in product." The deal is made. The pipeline is established. Billions start flowing. But there's a problem. Mexico has dozens of trafficking organizations, all competing, all creating chaos that's bad for everyone's business. Felix sees it clearly. The solution is organization, cooperation, unity. He travels across Mexico, meeting trafficker after trafficker, making his argument. This makes more money for everyone. This reduces violence. This reduces law enforcement attention. Here is your territory. Here is your route. Here is how we share the Colombian supply. The Federation is born. La Federación. One unified structure, multiple organizations, one coordinating intelligence. It works. Better than he imagined. By 1985, 1986, 1987, Felix Gallardo controls 90% of cocaine entering the United States. He is making billions. He is bribing everyone from beat cops to cabinet ministers. He is genuinely untouchable. He holds dinner parties at his mansion where his guests are the police chiefs and politicians responsible for arresting people like him. Then Kiki Camarena finds Rancho Buffalo, 2,500 acres of marijuana worth $8 billion, hidden in the Mexican desert. The plantation is destroyed. Caro Quintero loses his investment. He is furious. He wants to know who informed on them. He wants revenge. On February 7, 1985, Kiki Camarena is grabbed off a Guadalajara street by men connected to the Federation, taken to Caro Quintero's house, tortured for 30-plus hours by people trying to find out what he knew and who was talking. He dies from what is done to him on February 8th. His body is found a month later in a rural area of Michoacan. The United States does not respond calmly. Operation Leyenda is launched, the largest DEA homicide investigation in history. Hundreds of agents, unlimited resources, economic pressure on Mexico. The pressure is enormous. Caro Quintero is arrested in Costa Rica. Don Neto is arrested in Mexico. Felix manages to stay free for 4 more years. His corruption network holds, but it's fraying. April 8, 1989. Mexican federal police arrest Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo at his Guadalajara home. He is 43 years old. He does not resist. He is taken to Altiplano maximum security prison, and he has not been a free man since that day. Shortly after his arrest, he arranges the last meeting he will ever have as a criminal authority. His lieutenants come to the prison. He divides Mexico, Tijuana to the Arellano Felix brothers, his own nephews. Juárez to Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the Lord of the Skies, Sinaloa to El Chapo and El Mayo, the Gulf to Juan Garcia Abrego. He is trying to ensure an orderly transition. He is trying to prevent chaos. He believes, perhaps, that the territorial divisions will hold. They don't hold. Within months, the organizations begin fighting each other. Over routes, over territories, over money, over prestige. The careful peace that Felix had maintained through his personal authority shatters the moment he is removed, and the violence that replaces it builds and builds and builds. The Tijuana Cartel emerges and becomes notorious for extreme brutality. The Juárez Cartel under Amado Carrillo becomes the richest trafficking organization in history for a brief period, then collapses when Amado dies on a plastic surgeon's table. The Sinaloa operation under El Chapo and El Mayo grows into the most powerful drug trafficking organization in the world. The Gulf Cartel creates Los Zetas, military-trained killers who bring new levels of tactical violence to cartel warfare. Los Zetas eventually become their own cartel, spreading into new territories and introducing forms of mass killing that Mexico had never seen. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel emerges in the 2010s and challenges everyone. In 2006, President Calderon sends the Mexican military against the cartels. The cartels respond with military-grade violence. The next 18 years see 400,000 deaths, 100,000 or more disappearances, mass graves, journalists murdered, police chiefs assassinated, entire states effectively controlled by criminal organizations. And through it all, a river of cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and eventually fentanyl flows north into the United States, killing tens of thousands of Americans every year. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo is 80 years old. He is completely blind. He has serious heart disease. He uses a wheelchair. He has spent 37 years in prison and will, barring a change in the law or his death, spend the rest of his life there. Every day, people die because of the structure he created. He didn't order those deaths. He's been in prison for all of them. He is an old, blind, sick man who says he never wanted violence, and there is reason to believe that is sincerely true. He wanted peace. He wanted profit. He wanted organization. But the thing he built, the sophisticated, efficient, comprehensive criminal machine that was the Federation, when it shattered on the day of his arrest, the pieces became something he never intended and something he was powerless to stop. Pablo Escobar killed 4,000 people through terrorism. People he ordered killed. Deaths he chose. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo built a system that killed 400,000 people through structural violence, the inevitable consequence of competing criminal organizations fighting for territories that his organizational genius had defined. He was a police officer who became the greatest drug lord in Mexican history, a diplomat who created peace among criminals, a businessman who built an empire on cocaine and bribes and intelligence, a man who tried, at the very end of his freedom, to manage a peaceful transition, and failed in a way that condemned hundreds of thousands of people he never knew and never intended to harm. Netflix showed you an anti-hero, a complicated man building an empire in a morally complicated world. Diego Luna gave him charm and calculation and a certain tragic inevitability. The real Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo was all of that and more, and less. He was a man who made choices over decades that led to consequences he never fully controlled and could not ultimately prevent. He is 80 years old. He is blind. He is sick. He is in prison. And people are dying today as you watch this video, as you read this comment, as you go about your day because of what he built. This is the complete story of the godfather of Mexican cartels. If you watch this entire video, and I mean the whole thing, then you now understand the Mexican cartel world in a way that most people, including most commentators and journalists, never fully articulate. You understand where it came from. You understand the organizational intelligence that built it. You understand why it's so durable, so profitable, so resistant to every government effort to stop it. You understand the human cost of it. You understand why it continues. This video is part of a series. I did Pablo Escobar, 2 videos covering the Colombian supplier, the man who produced the cocaine that Felix moved. Now I've done Félix Gallardo, the Mexican distributor, the man who got it into America. Together, those stories give you the complete picture of the cocaine pipeline. How it was built. By whom? For what purpose? And at what cost? Subscribe right now because I am continuing this series with more cartel history, more real stories behind famous films and television shows, more deep dives into the true events that shape the world we live in. There is more coming, like this video. That thumbs up costs you nothing and tells the algorithm that this kind of content matters. Please do it. And comment. Tell me, did you watch Narcos Mexico on Netflix? How does what you've learned today change how you see that show? What number shocked you most? 400,000 dead since 1989? $8 billion at Rancho Buffalo? 90% of cocaine entering the United States controlled by one man? He is 80 years old, blind, in prison 37 years. And the violence continues. Does the unintended consequences argument change how you think about his responsibility? Share this video with anyone who watched Narcos Mexico, with anyone interested in cartel history, with anyone trying to understand why drug violence in Mexico continues after decades of enforcement, with anyone who wants to understand the world as it actually is. Diego Luna played Felix Gallardo as a complicated anti-hero, navigating a world of impossible choices with intelligence and ambition and occasional ruthlessness. The show was good. The research was real. The story was compelling. The truth is more complicated. The truth is a police officer who became a billionaire, a diplomat who united criminals, a man who created peace and was arrested and accidentally created war. A man who is old and blind and dying in a prison cell while the machine he built churns on without him, killing and killing and killing. Netflix showed you the rise. I showed you the complete story. Rise, fall, and the legacy of death that continues today. For 100,000 people. And counting. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.